I think James 1:19 through 20 really describes very well the person who we're going to be talking about this morning. And it's interesting because we believe that James was written by the brother of Jesus. And you see in James a lot of material that's also paralleled in Jesus' own teachings. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, almost everything in the Sermon on the Mount is restated in a fairly similar way in the book of James. And many have wondered whether maybe James and Jesus both heard a lot of the same teachings growing up and absorbed those, and then you saw them later on. And I wonder if they learned some of those things from Jesus' earthly father and James' father, Joseph, because I believe this especially would describe Jesus' earthly father, Joseph. The description is, "This you know, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger, for the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God." And I believe that's an excellent description of Joseph, Jesus' father. And as I pointed out in the bulletin this week, we actually don't have a single word of Joseph's recorded. We don't know a single word that he said. And so apparently he was slow to speak, or at least his legacy is not about the things that he said, but rather it's about the things that he did. So I'd like to talk a little this morning about Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus. And he's probably someone we don't talk a lot about precisely because we don't know what he said, and there's just a few sentences about what he did, and that's it. It's almost like Joseph did such a good job of fading in the background and letting Jesus be the center of attention that we almost don't even think about him or don't even realize that he was a part of the story. So, yes, to point out to start, he was a man of few words, and there are no verses on this slide because there's no verses that have him saying anything. As a matter of fact, the Gospel of Mark does not even mention Joseph, not even once, not even in a genealogy, as far as I'm aware. And John says nothing about him except that he's Jesus' earthly father, mentions him in a genealogy, maybe mentions one other time that Jesus is the son of Joseph. But that's it. And then in the other two, nothing that he says is recorded. We have phrases these days like someone is all bark and no bite, or all talk and no action. But a description of Joseph might be that he was all action and no talk. It was what he did that mattered, and not what he said. Even all the times in the Scripture, even for instance when you find his parents finding Jesus at the temple, it's his mother that steps forward and reprimands him and speaks to him. So I'd like to kind of go through some proverbs that maybe Joseph repeated to his sons when they were growing up, but proverbs in any case that describe this concept of the wisdom sometimes of letting our words be few. Proverbs 10:19 says, "When words are many, transgression is not lacking, but whoever restrains his lips is prudent." Proverbs 13:3 says, "Whoever guards his mouth preserves his life. He who opens wide his lips comes to ruin." And you'll see we're just going to continue to go through some of these proverbs. There were several of them. Proverbs 17:27 and 28. It says, "He who restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent." And then you've got Proverbs 18:2. "A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion." I think you really see Joseph doing the opposite of that. He probably had opinions about a lot of the things that happened to him and a lot of the things that he went through, especially on behalf of Mary, on behalf of Jesus. But we don't see him expressing his opinions. We see him instead trusting in the Lord. Proverbs 21:23, "Whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble." Proverbs 29:11, "A fool gives full vent to his spirit, but a wise man quietly holds it back." And then Proverbs 29:20, "Do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than for him." So there's a lot here in the Proverbs especially of these warnings about being exceptionally hasty, to take pleasure in expressing our opinions, or maybe to think we have all the answers or something like that. And I think Joseph is a really good example of someone who just did the right thing, who was known more for his actions instead of his words. One more from the New Testament would be 2 Timothy 2:16. It says, "But avoid irreverent babble, for it will lead people into more and more ungodliness." And I'm not suggesting that Joseph never said a word, that he was just, he walked around, never said anything. I'm sure he communicated effectively when he needed to, but it's interesting to note that his actions were what stood out in the end when we look back at his life, when we have the most important things about his life recorded. I hope that I can be like Joseph in that way. I hope that for all of us, that we won't just get to the end of our lives and people say, well, he was a good speaker, or, they were good at talking, but that we did something as well. And he was a working man. He was a carpenter. We only know this because of this one instance that's recorded in Matthew 13 and in Mark 6. They're talking about Jesus, and they say, "Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas?" So apparently Joseph was a carpenter, a man who did the noble work of taking what the earth gives us and using his hands to make useful things for people. And he must have taught Jesus about this as well, because in Mark 6:3 it's recorded that they asked, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us?" So it appears that his father invested this time and did what would have been common in their day to pass on the family trade down to his son, and taught him about carpentry as well. I get the idea that we would have liked Joseph. If he was a man of few words, he was a man who worked with his hands, just a simple down-to-earth individual who was faithful to God's will. And the scriptures actually tell us that he was a good man, essentially. It's rendered in different ways in these different translations of the Bible. In the NIV it says, Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law. The New Living Translation says he was a good man. The English Standard says he was a just man, or the New American Standard says he was a righteous man. So a lot of different ways that you could render the text. But to me, the idea is that he was a man of integrity. If he was faithful to the law, then you knew that he was going to follow God's will. And it's such a simple description to describe someone as a good man. Once again, I'd like to have a legacy like that. I think all of us would just like to have said of us, he was a good man or she was a good woman. They were good people. And that's what was recorded about Joseph. As if you didn't have to wonder whether he would choose to do the right thing or not. As if he was a man of conviction. And we can all learn to be people of conviction, people who, whatever else you could say about us, you could say that when given the opportunity, will choose to do the right thing. Back to Proverbs again. Proverbs 11:3 says, "The integrity of the upright guides them, but the unfaithful are destroyed by their duplicity." And that idea of duplicity would mean sort of having this divided mind where you sort of want to follow God, but you also want to go your own way. And maybe sometimes you decide to be devoted to God. Other times you decide to do your own thing, to rebel against His will. And that's contrasted with integrity. The idea of being faithful to the law, being righteous, being upright. And then Proverbs 21:3 says, "To do what is right and just is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice." Such a simple concept, do the right thing. But it's powerful if we put it into practice, if people know us as someone who sticks to our morals, who wants to live a life of integrity. The world needs more people who will just do the right thing. Hebrews 13:8 says, "Pray for us. We are sure that we have a clear conscience and desire to live honorably in every way." And as far as I'm aware, there's nothing we have recorded about Joseph that was dishonorable. He seemed to handle everything in a good way. He was also a gentle man, or a gentleman, if you will. And the same verses here that say that he was faithful to the law, that he was a good man, a just man, a righteous man, also talks about how he responded when he discovered that Mary was pregnant. And they weren't married yet, and he knew that the child wasn't his, and maybe he didn't know what was going on, but it does say he did not want to expose her to public disgrace. He did not want to disgrace her publicly, to put her to shame, or the New American Standard, not wanting to disgrace her. And this is considered a good thing. You see here, he was good, he was just, he was righteous, and because of that, he didn't want to put her to shame. He didn't take this pleasure in shaming someone else. It seems like in most cultures throughout time, no one can incur more shame than a young lady who has made bad decisions about sexual promiscuity. And so often we have so many bad words that we can call them. We have this gossip and rumors and things like that. And Joseph didn't really have anything to do with that. He didn't play into that common narrative that, he could have just totally publicly shamed her. And he didn't do that at all. He didn't want to do something like that. It was pointed out to me recently how there's an instance of sort of a double standard in the Bible along those lines, of a young woman who makes a mistake and a man who also makes a mistake, and how people are often very judgmental towards that woman. That story takes place in Genesis 38, starting with verses 13 through 16 here. We can't get into all of the background, but just to give you the basic background, Tamar was supposed to receive a husband from her father-in-law Judah, and he didn't give her that husband, and that sort of sets the stage for this. It was told Tamar, "Behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah had grown up and she had not been given to him as a wife, which is what was supposed to happen. It says, when Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here now, let me come into you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And in this story part that we're skipping over is that she takes from him these objects that she can later use to prove that it was he who had thought she was a prostitute and had done these things. Now, 3 months later, verses 24 through 26, about 3 months later, Judah was informed, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry." Then Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." So that's his initial reaction. Certainly one of publicly shaming someone of, I don't know whether he took pleasure in it or not, but of truly being as harsh as he could be in his response to this event. "Bring her out and let her be burned." It was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, "I am with child by the man to whom these things belong." And she said, "Please examine and see whose signet ring and cord and staff are these." And Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not have relations with her again. So Judah goes from saying, "Bring her out and let her be burned," because she played the harlot, to all of a sudden saying, "She is more righteous than I," when it's revealed that he was involved in the same thing that she was. To me, that's sort of an illustration of the double standard, for instance, that Judah has here. I mean, Judah is so willing to say, somebody ought to be burned for doing something like that. And then a minute later, it turns out he did the exact same thing. And all of a sudden, he changes his tune entirely. And it's sort of a caution to us. You hear people say, don't judge someone else more harshly because they sin in a different way than you do. Don't want to deny the fact that different sins have different consequences, that some sins could be considered more serious than others. But I do want to remind us to be gentle with people. Another example of a similar situation might be in John 8:7, where this woman is caught in adultery. There's no sign that they're going to bring the man to Jesus, but they bring the woman. And they keep asking Jesus whether they should stone her to death or not. When they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." It's interesting to me how often you see in Jesus and in James reflections of their father, their earthly father, Jesus' earthly father, and I think you see that here. he's willing to have compassion on someone when it appears that they have done something wrong, and not to take pleasure in shaming them and doing this public shame event that he certainly could have done. So he was a good man, Joseph was, and a gentle man who did not take pleasure in shaming others. He is also a careful man. You realize this. When you read, when he had considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child who's been conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. So when Joseph realizes what's going on, instead of just going out there and exploding and making a big public spectacle, he stops and he considers that he should do things as quietly and decently and honorably as he can and have compassion on her. And in that context, he actually has this opportunity to realize the truth and to salvage this relationship that he has with Mary. It's because of his carefulness that he was able to do that. If he had just immediately stormed out and made assumptions, that wouldn't have been an option for him anymore. Proverbs 18:7 says, the first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him. Surely it seemed pretty obvious to Joseph what had happened, and yet, because he was so careful, because he took his time in figuring out what had gone on, because he didn't jump to conclusions, he found out something he didn't know at first that changed the way he was going to respond to the situation. I believe he was also a patient man. It says, Joseph awoke from his sleep and did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took Mary as his wife, but kept her a virgin until she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. Most people wouldn't want to be told, sure, you can be married, but just put off your honeymoon for a few months, and your wife is going to be pregnant, and that's probably not particularly fun for Joseph as he's just beginning this marriage. But he does that. It says he kept her a virgin until she gave birth to a son. It probably wasn't in his plans to do that. And in everything he did, he was a faithful servant. A lot of things happened in Joseph's life that he wasn't planning, and you don't hear him say a word about him. You just see him doing exactly what he ought to do. So in Matthew 12:13-15, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night and left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. I don't know if Joseph had particular aspirations in terms of his carpentry, if he was, gaining more and more customers that he was building up, or I don't know what connections he had in the community where he lived, but he probably didn't plan for his wife to suddenly be pregnant, and then he didn't plan to have to pick up everything and move to Egypt. But it's just kind of a straightforward recording here, almost as if Joseph is just like a cog in the machine that's working flawlessly. The angel comes and says, you've got to flee to Egypt, and Joseph gets up in the night and he goes to Egypt. Then the angel comes to him again, or an angel comes to him again later in Matthew 2. You get the idea. He's probably always kind of worried when the angel comes about what's going to happen next in his life. It says, when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up, take the child and his mother, and go into the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Then, after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee and came and lived in a city called Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken of through the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. So many dreams that came to Joseph over these years that directed the course of his life, of figuring out what was going on with Mary and what he should do about it, of fleeing to Egypt, of going back to Israel, of settling in this new area instead of where his old home had been. And it seems that he dealt with all of that uncertainty just by following where God led. I'm sure many of us will have things that we didn't plan come into our lives and uncertainty come into our lives. And hopefully we can follow the way that Joseph did. So here's the observations we made about Joseph. He was a man of few words, apparently, or at least his legacy was about what he did instead of about the words that he said. He was a working man, a good man, which is such a simple description, but such a powerful one. He was a gentle man who, even when it was in his power to leverage himself against others, to shame others, to enjoy that, he didn't do that. A careful man, a patient man, and a faithful servant of God who followed where God led. So there's a lot of things there, I think, that we can learn from Joseph, that we can hope to be like him. It seems like a lot of people around Jesus did a good job of letting him shine. You know, his mother often is just sort of standing to the side, treasuring these things in her heart, wondering what they mean. You've got John the Baptist saying that he must become greater and I must become less. And I'm just happy as the bridegroom to see the groom have his success. And then you have Joseph, who was almost so good at fading into the background that you almost don't even realize that he was there. But he did a lot of important things. He protected Jesus and his mother when Jesus was this young and vulnerable child who needed that protection. And he did so many things right to make the story of Jesus, which is the center of the gospel, go smoothly. I hope that we can just strive to be like Joseph, strive to be good people, simple people, the way that he was. I'd like to extend an invitation to everyone here. I'll always extend an invitation if anyone wants to be baptized into Christ. Also, if there's anything else we can do for you, if we can pray for you, or if you'd like to confess sin, or if we can help you in any way at all, then you can come as we stand and sing together.
Jesus calls us for the tumult of our lives, while restless sea, day by day his sweet voice soundeth, saying, Christian, follow me. Jesus calls us from the worship of the vain world's golden store, from each idol that would keep us, saying, Christian, love me more. Jesus calls us by thy mercies, Savior, make us hear thy call. Give our hearts to thine obedience, serve and love thee best of all.